This is the exact nightmare that Valerie Sterling lived through. But just as the cell door clanged shut and all hope seemed lost, a prison guard looked at her and whispered a phrase that would change everything. The plan begins tonight. This story isn't just about betrayal. It's about finding light in the darkest of places. The ending, without a doubt, will warm your heart and leave you with a smile of satisfaction. Before we begin, a moment of your time. Show your enthusiasm by hitting those like and subscribe buttons, and don't forget to leave your name, your city, and the word present in the comments section below. Now, let's start the story. That morning, peace reigned in Valerie's luxurious Greenwood Hills estate. The morning sun filtered through the enormous bay windows, illuminating an impeccably tidy dining room. Valerie was enjoying a hot cup of coffee, gazing out at the beautifully manicured backyard garden. Everything seemed perfect. She had her dream house, a thriving company inherited from her late father, and, of course, a handsome husband who seemed to love her immensely. Her husband, Richard Vance, had just come downstairs. He looked commanding in an expensive suit, ready for the office. Richard approached Valerie, gave her a tender kiss on the forehead, and sat down across from her. "The coffee you make is always the best, darling," Richard praised her with that sweet smile that always melted Valerie's heart. She smiled back. "Finish your breakfast, or you'll be late for the board meeting," Valerie said gently. But the peace of that morning was shattered in an instant. The wail of police sirens echoed in front of their tall gates, breaking the silence of the exclusive gated community. Before Valerie could process what was happening, the front door of the house burst open. A group of heavily armed police officers entered with determined steps and stern faces. The housekeeping staff screamed in fear and scattered to the corners of the room. Valerie shot to her feet, trembling. The coffee mug nearly slipped from her hands. Her heart pounded so hard it felt like it would burst from her chest. "Valerie Sterling, you're under arrest," an officer exclaimed in a thundering voice, pointing directly at Valerie's face. Valerie's jaw dropped. Her face turned pale. "What? Arrested? What did I do, officer? There must be a mistake. You're accused of corporate embezzlement and money laundering to the tune of tens of millions of dollars. We have solid evidence. Let's go to the station. Now," the officer shouted without mercy. Valerie's world seemed to crumble. Embezzlement, money laundering, they were incredibly vile accusations. Her entire life, she had maintained her late father's legacy with absolute integrity. She had never touched a single dollar from the company for illicit personal gain. Valerie turned desperately to Richard, expecting him to intervene and defend her, to be her shield as he had promised in their wedding vows. And at first glance, it seemed Richard was truly doing just that. "Officer, wait a moment. This has to be a mistake," Richard said, pushing his way through the police. His face was filled with horror, and tears welled in his eyes. He even knelt before the officer, pleading in a broken voice. "My wife is a good person, officer. She wouldn't do something like this. Please, don't take her. Check your evidence again." Valerie felt moved watching her husband struggle. In the midst of her extreme panic, she felt she still had someone to lean on. "Richard, help me." "I didn't do anything wrong," Valerie sobbed softly. Richard stood up and hugged Valerie tightly, so very tightly. "It's okay, honey. I won't let them touch you. I'll get the best lawyer in the country." "You have to be strong," Richard whispered in her ear. But in the instant that hug occurred, Valerie felt something was off. Richard's body wasn't trembling. His breathing was regular, calm, and serene. There were no signs of a racing heart like that of a husband whose beloved wife is about to be dragged to jail. Richard's physical calm completely contradicted the pleas coming from his mouth. "Enough of the theatrics. Take the suspect away," the officer ordered. Two policemen forcibly separated their embrace. Valerie's delicate hands were roughly pulled behind her back. The cold click of the metal handcuffs felt painful on her wrists, snatching away her freedom. Valerie was dragged out of her own home like a criminal. "Richard!" Valerie cried out in desperation, looking back as she was hauled towards the exit. It was then, on the threshold of her magnificent house, that Valerie witnessed a scene that froze her blood, a vision colder than prison bars. Richard stood there. The terrified face and the tears that had been streaming down his cheeks moments ago were gone, as if erased by an invisible hand. He calmly adjusted the lapels of his suit. His gaze toward Valerie was not one of sadness or loss. Slowly, The corners of Richard's lips curled upwards, forming a smile of pure satisfaction. He watched as the police took Valerie away, and then he slyly gave her a wink. That look seemed to say, "Enjoy your new home, dear wife. Your fortune is mine now." In that moment, Valerie realized this wasn't an administrative error, nor was it slander from a business competitor. It was a trap, a meticulously designed trap by the man who slept beside her every night, her own husband, so he could take control of all her assets and the company without any obstacles. Valerie was pushed into a stuffy transport van. Through the barred window, she could see her neighbors, who had started to gather, looking at her with contempt and condemnation. The vehicle started, leaving behind her luxurious home, which now seemed like a memory from the past. In the solitude of the van, Valerie's tears began to flow, no longer from fear, but from the piercing pain of betrayal that tore at her heart. Richard had discarded her in the trash heap of a jail cell. But behind those tears, Valerie's hands, despite being cuffed, clenched into tight fists. She made a vow in her heart. These will be the last tears I ever shed for that man. The stale air of the detention center's visiting room was suffocating, with a nauseating smell of sweat and cheap floor cleaner. Valerie sat on a cold metal chair. Her body felt bruised, despite not having done any physical labor. The orange inmate jumpsuit she now wore felt rough against her skin, a substitute for the silk dresses she used to wear. Her face was pale and makeup-free, and the dark circles under her eyes indicated she hadn't slept a second since being incarcerated in this horrible place. The metal door creaked open. Valerie lifted her head, expecting to see the face of Attorney Morrison, her late father's trusted lawyer whom she considered a mother figure. But that hope vanished in an instant. The person who walked in was Richard. Her husband looked very fresh and well-groomed, a stark contrast to Valerie's disheveled appearance. The scent of his expensive cologne, which Valerie used to buy for him, wafted in, as if mocking Valerie's situation, who now smelled of prison dampness. Richard sat down nonchalantly across from Valerie. He looked at his wife, not with longing, but as if inspecting damaged goods. Without a greeting or asking how she was, Richard placed a thick binder directly on the table that separated them. The sound of the binder hitting the metal table echoed in the silent room. "Sign this," Richard said curtly, sliding an expensive pen toward Valerie. Valerie looked at the binder with confused eyes and then into her husband's eyes. "What is this, Richard? Where's Attorney Morrison? I've been asking the guard to contact her since the first day. Why hasn't she come?" Richard let out a small laugh, a dry, dismissive laugh. He leaned back arrogantly in his chair. "Attorney Morrison. Ah, that old woman. She won't be coming, Valerie. Not today, not tomorrow, and probably never again." Valerie's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" "She's our family's lawyer. I've told the facility managers and the investigators that you're suffering from mental distress due to the shock and that you refuse to see anyone except your husband," Richard replied indifferently, toying with the end of his tie. "Besides, I've hired a new lawyer for you. One who, of course, works for my interests, not yours." Valerie's eyes widened in disbelief. Her connection to the outside world had been completely severed. She was like a bird with broken wings, trapped in a soundproof cage. "You're a monster, Richard. You're the devil," Valerie whispered with a trembling voice, containing her rage. "What's in that binder? You want to steal the company from me, don't you?" "Smart girl," Richard praised her sarcastically. "It's a power of attorney for the full transfer of assets. Control of the company, the properties, and all accounts in your name are to be transferred to mine. The reason is simple and logical, my dear. Since you're now a suspect in a corruption and money laundering case, your assets are at risk of being seized by the state. The only way to save our fortune is to transfer it to my name, which is clean, before it's too late." "It's not our fortune, it's my father's legacy," Valerie shouted, tears welling in her eyes. "And I'm not corrupt. You framed me. You forged the financial reports, didn't you? You ordered the finance staff to insert fake transactions." Richard leaned forward. His face was now very close to the dividing glass. His smile widened, revealing his greedy nature. "Yes, I did. So what? Who's going to believe you? The wife who knows nothing about business, or the loyal husband fighting to save the family assets? The world has already condemned you, Valerie. The news of your arrest has made headlines in every paper and on every news channel. The company's stock has plummeted, and investors are in a panic. If you don't sign this, your father's company will go bankrupt and fall to pieces." Valerie clenched her fists until her knuckles turned white. The pain in her heart was far worse than the police's accusations. The man she loved, whom she had promoted from a simple employee to CEO, was now stomping on her head while she was on the ground. "I'm not signing," Valerie refused firmly. "I'll wait until I can speak to the judge. The truth will come out." Richard sighed heavily, as if dealing with a stubborn child. His face turned cold and cruel. "Listen to me, Valerie. Inside these walls, money is king. If you continue to be stubborn, I can make your life here a living hell. Or you can sign, and I'll take care of you. You'll spend a few years in prison, but at least you'll live comfortably in a special cell. You'll eat well, and I won't divorce you. But if you refuse—" Richard paused. His eyes glinted with menace. "You will rot in here. Attorney Morrison can't help you. No one cares about you. You are alone." Richard stood up casually and straightened his suit. He glanced at his expensive watch. "I'll give you until tomorrow to think about it. Remember, Valerie, that signature is your ticket to survival or to total ruin." The man walked out of the room without looking back, leaving Valerie slumped and powerless. His back slowly disappeared behind the metal door that closed with a thud. Silence returned to the room. Valerie lowered her head and stared at the empty table in front of her. She felt so small and weak. Richard's strategy was meticulous. He isolated her, destroyed her spirit, and then offered her a false way out. Valerie realized that if she signed those papers, Richard would divorce her immediately and leave her to die in prison without a penny. But if she didn't sign, how could she fight from behind these bars without Attorney Morrison's help? Desperation began to creep in and tighten its grip on her throat. Valerie's tears fell onto the cold floor. She was truly alone in this cruel world. There was no Prince Charming, no miracles, just her and the cold concrete walls. At least, that's what she thought at that moment, not yet knowing that help sometimes comes from the most unexpected places, often from figures you don't see at first glance. That night, Richard's threats came true. They weren't just idle boasts. Her husband made sure to demonstrate his power. Around 2 a.m., when Valerie was just managing to fall asleep in a common cell that already felt horrible, 2 stern-faced female guards appeared. Without a word, they ordered her to gather her meager belongings. Valerie was led down a long and increasingly remote corridor. The atmosphere grew darker and damper as they went. The end of her journey was a heavy, rusted metal door in the solitary confinement section. It was the place all inmates feared, a place where a person's mental fortitude is tested to its limits. When the door closed and was locked from the outside, total darkness enveloped Valerie. There was no light, only a faint moonbeam filtering through a small ventilation shaft high up on the ceiling. The cell was tiny and smelled of dampness, a mixture of mold and air that was never circulated. There was no bed, just a cold cement floor that chilled her to the bone. Days passed without her knowing how much time had gone by. Valerie didn't know if it was sunny or raining outside. The only food she received was a bit of stale bread and a watery broth passed through a small slit at the bottom of the door. No one spoke to her. The silence in there was so deafening it began to slowly eat away at her sanity. By the 3rd day in solitary, Valerie's defenses began to crumble. The vision of Richard's mocking face haunted her in every dark corner of the cell. Her husband's words echoed in her ears like a cursed spell. "You will rot in here. You are alone." Hunger, cold, and loneliness started to make her think irrationally. Maybe Richard was right. Maybe resisting was futile. If she signed, at least she could get out of this rat hole. At least she could see the sun again, even if she lost her fortune. The desire to give up was so intense it oppressed Valerie's chest, which she relieved with incessant crying. She had made a decision. The next morning, she would call the guard and ask to see Richard to sign those damn papers. However, fate had other plans for that night. She heard the sound of heavy footsteps approaching her cell. They were different from the usual guards. The sharp screech of metal on metal sounded as a key turned in the lock. The heavy iron door opened slowly, revealing the silhouette of a burly man blocking the little light from the hallway. Valerie scrambled back in fear, pressing herself against the cold wall. She hugged her knees and trembled. Was this a man sent by Richard to torture her? The man entered carrying a food tray. His face was revealed under the dim hallway light. It was Officer Romero, one of the most feared senior guards. His stern face and deep wrinkles showed he was not someone to be trifled with. His thick mustache and penetrating gaze made even the toughest inmates lower their heads. Until now, Officer Romero was known for being a man of principle and very strict. Officer Romero set the food tray on the floor with some roughness, producing a clatter that startled Valerie. "Eat," Officer Romero commanded in a deep, monotonous voice. Valerie didn't dare to reply, just nodded silently. Her eyes didn't dare to look at the fearsome guard's face. She waited for Officer Romero to turn and leave, but the man didn't move. Officer Romero stood there in silence. His eyes scanned every dark corner of the cell as if looking for something. He looked up at the ventilation shaft, then at the corner of the door. After making sure no microphone or security camera was pointed at that corner, Officer Romero's posture changed dramatically. His shoulders, previously tense, relaxed slightly. He knelt on one knee and brought his face close to Valerie's. Valerie became even more frightened, her breath caught in her throat. "Please, don't hit me," she whispered weakly. Officer Romero brought his index finger to his lips, signaling Valerie to be quiet. His gaze, which moments ago was sharp and fearsome, changed. There was a deep compassion and seriousness in it now. He brought his mouth to Valerie's ear. His voice came out in a barely audible whisper, but to Valerie's ears, it was incredibly clear. "Don't give up, ma'am." "Mrs. Sterling, don't sign anything," Officer Romero whispered quickly. Valerie's eyes widened, and she looked confusedly at that rough face. Officer Romero continued whispering, his eyes fixed on hers, reassuring her. "The plan begins tonight. Attorney Morrison sends her regards. She's fighting for you out there." The name Attorney Morrison was like a lightning bolt that struck Valerie's consciousness. It was a password that no one sent by Richard could possibly know. Richard had said that Attorney Morrison didn't care anymore, but this guard, the one who seemed the most terrifying, was bringing her a message from her. Before Valerie could ask, Officer Romero straightened up again. His face was once again a cold, expressionless iron mask. "Finish your food and don't give the guards any trouble." Officer Romero suddenly shouted, returning to his original role as a fierce jailer, as if the whisper from a moment ago had never happened. He turned and walked out with a determined stride. The metal door slammed shut and was locked again. Valerie was left alone in the darkness again, but this time the darkness felt different. The cold air that chilled her bones no longer made her tremble with despair. Her heart pounded, not from fear, but from a ray of hope that suddenly burned brightly in her chest. Attorney Morrison hadn't abandoned her. She wasn't alone. And most incredibly, in this place she thought was hell, there was a guardian angel disguised as a demon. Valerie picked up the food tray. For the first time in 3 days, she ate ravenously. She needed strength. She needed to be strong. She knew the real war had just begun, and Valerie had to survive to win it. The next day, the routine in the solitary confinement section changed slightly. It wasn't a female guard who brought breakfast, but Officer Romero again. This time, he came under the pretext of a routine cell inspection. The sound of his baton striking the iron bars sounded sharp and threatening, terrifying the other inmates in the section. "Step back and get in the corner. Hands behind your head," Officer Romero shouted abruptly as Valerie's cell door opened. Valerie, who now understood this act a little, obeyed immediately. She stood trembling in a corner of the damp cell. Meanwhile, Officer Romero entered and began to search her thin pillow and roughly inspect the cracks in the walls. His movements seemed violent to anyone watching from the security camera at the end of the hall, but for Valerie, who was close, she could see that those burly hands moved with utmost care not to damage her only place to sleep. When Officer Romero crouched near Valerie, pretending to inspect the floor, he spoke again in a low voice, very low, almost drowned out by the sound of his boots that he deliberately made himself. "Don't worry, ma'am. The camera in the hall can't record sound in this corner," he whispered quickly. Valerie mustered her courage and looked at that rough face. "Why? Why are you doing this? If Richard finds out, they could fire you or even put you in jail." Officer Romero sighed briefly. His eyes seemed to look through the gloomy prison walls for a moment. 10 years ago, ma'am, do you remember the Sterling Heart program that Sterling Enterprises organized for low-income families?" Valerie frowned, searching her confused memories. It was an annual program from my father's company. We funded surgeries for hundreds of people in need. I was one of them," Officer Romero interrupted firmly. His deep voice had a tremor of emotion. Back then, I was a temporary security guard at a warehouse by the docks. I had a serious heart problem. The doctor said if I didn't have coronary bypass surgery immediately, I would die. But the cost was hundreds of thousands of dollars. Where was a simple guard going to get that kind of money? I had already resigned myself, prepared to die and leave my wife and my young children. Valerie was stunned to hear this. She had never imagined that an act of kindness she considered a simple corporate obligation had a face and a name. Then the notification came. Officer Romero continued, his hands clenched into fists to contain his emotion. Your foundation covered 100% of the costs. You don't know who I am. You probably just signed a stack of approval papers from the comfort of your office. But that signature of yours is what keeps my heart beating today. Your signature is what allowed my children to still have a father. Tears welled in Valerie's eyes. Just when she felt the whole world had betrayed her, a seed of kindness she had planted in the past had now grown into a protective tree. I made an oath then, ma'am, Officer Romero whispered again. His eyes looked intently into Valerie's. If I could ever repay the favor, I would give my life for it. And when I saw your name on the list of inmates in solitary today, I knew this was the time. Officer Romero, Valerie whispered, overwhelmed with emotion. Listen, ma'am, Officer Romero interrupted her, returning to his state of alertness. I can't get you out of here. That would be breaking the law and would only turn you into a fugitive. We have to act smart. Attorney Morrison needs evidence. Richard is cunning and has probably destroyed all the physical documents at the company and at home, but Attorney Morrison is sure that the founder's daughter of Sterling Enterprises must have a backup plan. Valerie closed her eyes and thought hard. Richard had been truly meticulous. The laptop, the documents, the safe, everything had fallen into her husband's hands. But Richard had forgotten one thing. Richard was new to the company. He didn't know the old habit that Valerie's late father had taught her. Always keep the key closest to your heartbeat. The locket, Valerie murmured. Suddenly her eyes opened wide. The locket necklace? Officer Romero asked. The white gold locket I was wearing when they arrested me. It's not just a piece of jewelry, officer. Inside, there's a hidden memory microchip. My father designed it especially. All the original financial report data, before Richard manipulated it, copies of assets, and proof of illegal transfers that I suspected it's all automatically saved there every time I access the main server. That's the key. Officer Romero's face hardened. Where is that necklace now? The booking officer confiscated it when I came in. They put it in a personal effects bag. Richard surely doesn't know. He'd think it's just a cheap trinket, so he wouldn't have taken it. Officer Romero nodded slowly. His mind, familiar with prison procedures, began to work immediately. The evidence storage is a restricted area. Only the warden has the key. But Officer Romero smiled slightly, a meaningful smile. There's a shift change tonight. The guard at the storage room has a gambling debt with one of the inmates, and I know his weak spot. The sound of approaching footsteps in the hallway made Officer Romero stand up instantly. He put on his tough guy face again and yelled at Valerie, "All right, no contraband here. Clean this floor and don't be lazy." Officer Romero lightly kicked an empty water bottle towards Valerie, shouting loudly. Before turning and leaving, Officer Romero shot her a very brief look, but one that gave Valerie immense strength, a signal that said, "Leave it to me." The metal door closed again with a thud. Valerie was alone again, but this time she didn't cry. She sat on the cold floor with her back straight. The hunger and fatigue seemed to evaporate. She brought her hand to her chest, to the spot where that locket used to hang. A good deed planted without expecting anything in return 10 years ago. Now it was coming back to her as the ultimate weapon. Richard might have the money and power to buy the law, but he didn't have the sincere loyalty of those whose lives had been saved. Valerie smiled slightly in the darkness. "Wait for my revenge, Richard. You built your castle on sand, and the tide is about to come in." That night, the sky seemed to share the tension that enveloped the detention center. A torrential rain pounded on the tin roof, creating a perfect noise to hide stealthy footsteps. Occasional flashes of lightning illuminated the dark, silent corridors. Officer Romero buttoned up his uniform jacket. In his right pocket, he clutched a small object he had bought at a street market that afternoon before his shift ended. It was a cheap replica of a necklace, almost identical in shape to Valerie's locket. It was simple plated metal, but enough to deceive a careless eye under the dim light of the storage room. Officer Romero's heavy steps stopped right in front of the guard post for the evidence storage room. Sitting there was a young Officer Perez, whose face paled upon seeing his superior. Officer Perez had a considerable gambling debt with an inmate who controlled the block, and Officer Romero had been preventing that inmate from harming him. One favor for another. 5 minutes, Perez, Officer Romero said curtly, staring intently at his subordinate. That's all I need. Officer Perez swallowed hard. Cold sweat beaded on his temples, even though the night air was cool. He glanced nervously from side to side, making sure the officer on duty wasn't passing by. With a trembling hand, he handed Officer Romero the key to the large padlock on the storage room. "Quick, sir. If the warden finds out, we're both finished," Perez whispered in a broken voice. Officer Romero didn't reply. He snatched the key and immediately opened the metal door of the storage room. The musty smell of thousands of clothes, bags, and personal items of inmates hit him in the face. The room was filled with metal shelves arranged like a labyrinth. Guided by the light of a small flashlight held in his mouth, Officer Romero moved quickly, following the name tags on the shelves. Finally, he reached the S section. His heart pounded to the rhythm of the thunder rumbling outside. He had to hurry. Sterling, Valerie. Officer Romero found the clear plastic bag containing Valerie's belongings. Inside, he saw a leather wallet, a wristwatch, and that white gold locket, a small, fragile-looking object, yet it held the ammunition capable of toppling the false business empire Richard was building. With a small blade, Officer Romero carefully sliced open the plastic seal so it wouldn't look damaged. He took out the real locket, which felt heavy and cold in his hand. He observed it for a moment, an elegant, heart-shaped pendant. Without wasting time, he placed the imitation locket he had brought inside the plastic, adjusting its position to look identical to the original. With a swift movement, the plastic seal was cleanly resealed. Almost perfect. No one would suspect anything unless they examined it with a magnifying glass. Officer Romero tucked the real locket into the deepest pocket of his undergarments, the safest place, where he wouldn't be routinely searched. He left the storage room just as Officer Perez, anxious about the time, was about to knock on the door. "Done. Keep your mouth shut, and your debt is safe," Officer Romero threatened, handing the key back to Perez. The young officer nodded quickly, his face full of relief, as if he had just escaped a death trap. The first mission was accomplished. Now for the second, much more dangerous part, getting the object outside the prison walls. Officer Romero walked towards the back of the detention center. There was the final trash disposal area that connected directly to the back road. The clock read 3 a.m. The garbage truck contracted by the detention center was due to arrive to pick up the kitchen waste. Under the pouring rain, Officer Romero stood, pretending to supervise the inmate helpers loading trash bags onto the loading dock. The garbage truck driver, an older man in a worn-out hat, got out to sign the service log. The moment Officer Romero handed him the clipboard to sign, there was a lightning-fast movement of hands under their raincoats. The locket, wrapped in a thick handkerchief, passed from Officer Romero's hand to the driver's. No words were spoken, just a meaningful exchange of glances. That driver was a trusted man whom Attorney Morrison had infiltrated as a new employee at the sanitation company the previous week. The garbage truck roared away, carrying the evidence of Richard's crimes out from behind the bars and into the hands of Attorney Morrison, who was preparing to counterattack. Meanwhile, inside the dark solitary cell, Valerie was kneeling on her thin mat. She couldn't sleep. Her mind was anxious, waiting for news. Had Officer Romero succeeded, or had he been caught? If he was caught, her last hope would be gone. Richard would surely tighten security, move her to a more horrible prison, or to a remote island where no one could contact her. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed again in the solitary hallway. Valerie's heart stopped for a moment. She held her breath and pressed her ear to the metal door. The footsteps stopped right in front of her cell. There was no sound of it opening, no shouting, just 3 light knocks on the door. Tap, tap, tap. It was the agreed-upon rhythm. And then, Officer Romero's voice was heard, this time speaking loudly, as if scolding an inmate, but the content was a code for Valerie. "Hey, you in there! Stop making noise and get to sleep! The bird has flown the coop!" His fierce shout echoed in the empty hallway. Then the footsteps moved away. Valerie's body slumped weakly to the floor. Tears of relief rolled down her cheeks. The bird has flown the coop, the locket was out, the evidence was safe. Amidst the cold prison floor and the smell of dampness, Valerie felt a warmth spreading through her chest. Hope was real. For the first time since she was imprisoned, Valerie smiled. Not a smile of fear, but a smile of victory. She imagined Richard's face, who by now would be fast asleep in his plush bed, unaware that a massive storm was heading his way from the outside. "Sleep well tonight, Richard," Valerie whispered in the darkness, "because soon you won't be able to sleep again." Valerie closed her eyes, and for the first time in many nights, she fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. Outside, the rain began to subside, leaving a smell of wet earth that promised a new dawn. The wheels of fate had begun to turn, and this time, no one, not even Richard's money, could stop them. The clinking of crystal glasses echoed beautifully in the living room of the luxurious estate, a stark contrast to the situation of its original owner, curled up on the cement floor of a prison. Richard, with a glass of expensive scotch in his hand, stood in the middle of the room, contemplating his surroundings with overflowing satisfaction. Around him, several interior designers were busy taking down the abstract paintings that Valerie loved so much, replacing them with classical-style paintings in ostentatious gold frames. The elegant, minimalist pastel-toned sofas had already been removed and replaced with dark leather furniture that gave off a masculine, arrogant vibe. Richard was erasing, inch by inch, any trace of his wife in that house. "A little more to the left. Careful, that's Ming Dynasty porcelain. It's more expensive than your lives," Richard shouted at the workers before smiling broadly and taking another sip of his drink. His cell phone rang. Richard glanced at the screen. It was the name of the new CFO. He answered nonchalantly. "How did it go?" "Is it done?" Richard asked bluntly. "It's done, Mr. Vance," the voice on the other end of the line replied, nervous but submissive. "Access to all of Mrs. Sterling's company accounts has been completely frozen per your instructions. All cash flow for new projects has been diverted to the offshore account you indicated." "Good," Richard sneered. "Make sure there's no digital trail. If the auditors ask, tell them it's strategic funding for market expansion." Richard hung up. He felt invincible. With Valerie isolated and branded a criminal, the shareholders had no choice but to appoint him as interim CEO. His plan was unfolding perfectly. That same afternoon, Richard arrived at the headquarters of Sterling Enterprises. His stride was confident and arrogant as he entered the lobby. Longtime employees bowed their heads in fear, not daring to look into the eyes of the boss's husband, who now acted like a petty king. Richard went straight to Valerie's office. In front of the door, her loyal secretary of 15 years, Miss Davis, blocked his path. The middle-aged woman's eyes were red and swollen from crying. "Step aside, Miss Davis," Richard said coldly. "Mr. Vance, you can't just do as you please," Miss Davis said with a trembling voice, containing her anger. "President Sterling has not yet been found guilty. This is still her office, and you have no authority to fire the internal audit team staff without the board's approval." Richard let out a small, chilling laugh. He brought his face close to Miss Davis's. "Miss Davis, you're still living in the past. My lovely wife is now counting cockroaches in a cell. The law here now is me." Richard pulled an envelope from his jacket and slapped it against Miss Davis's chest. "This is your termination letter. 0 severance. I've found evidence that you conspired with Valerie to embezzle funds. Pack your things now, or security will drag you out like your boss." Miss Davis gasped, incredulous. "This is slander. You're a demon." "Security!" Richard shouted. 2 burly security guards immediately came and took away Miss Davis, who was crying hysterically. Richard entered Valerie's office, slammed the door shut, and sat in his wife's large chair. He swiveled the chair to look out the large window that offered a panoramic view of the Chicago skyline. He felt like he had the world at his feet. Meanwhile, in an old but distinguished law firm on the outskirts of the city, an atmosphere of quiet tension reigned. Attorney Helen Morrison sat behind her desk with a jeweler's loop in her right eye. Across from her, a computer expert manipulated a laptop connected to a chip reader. Valerie's white gold locket lay open on the desk. "Did you get it open?" Attorney Morrison asked, her voice thick with anxiety. The white-haired woman, her hair in an impeccable bun, clasped her sweaty hands. The fate of her friend's daughter depended on this small object. The computer expert quickly typed a series of codes. The laptop screen flickered several times, and then green text appeared. "Access granted. We're in. Counselor," the expert replied. The encryption was sophisticated, but the key was valid. "All the data is here. The original ledgers, recordings of voice conversations that were automatically saved when the app was activated, and even records of hidden bank transactions." Attorney Morrison immediately moved closer. Her eyes scanned line by line the figures on the screen. The more she read, the wider a smile spread across her aged face. "Incredible," Morrison murmured. Richard thought he was smart, forging Valerie's digital signature, but he forgot that this chip's backup system records the IP address and location of the access device. All these illegal transactions were made from Richard's personal laptop and phone. Attorney Morrison pointed to a video file. "Play this, please." The video was a recording from a hidden camera in Valerie's home study. It was a security feature Valerie had installed to monitor a hidden safe inside a smoke detector, which Richard knew nothing about. In the video, Richard was seen laughing and chatting with the finance employee he had bribed while moving wads of cash from Valerie's safe into a gym bag. "You've dug your own grave, Richard," Attorney Morrison whispered triumphantly. She immediately picked up her phone and contacted the presiding judge of the circuit court, not to bribe him, of course, but to submit urgent new evidence that would change the course of tomorrow's trial. "Prepare the documents," Morrison ordered her assistant. "Tomorrow, at the trial, we're going to put on a surprise show. Make sure the press attends. We're going to strip Richard's villainy bare in front of the whole country." Back at Valerie's luxurious estate, night had fallen. Richard was enjoying a sumptuous solo dinner at the long dining table. He was very calm. Tomorrow was the day of the preliminary hearing. With the fake evidence he had prepared and the lack of a proper defense for Valerie, the judge would surely dismiss any motions and keep Valerie in prison. After that, the divorce would be easy to obtain, and the entire fortune would be in his hands. "Just one more step," Richard muttered, cutting into the filet mignon on his plate. "After tomorrow, Valerie is finished." He didn't know that outside the walls of his house, a black van from the prosecutor's investigative team, which had just received an anonymous data leak from Attorney Morrison, was parked silently. They didn't arrest Richard that night. Attorney Morrison asked them to wait. The execution of Richard's career and reputation would not take place in a silent house, but on the grand stage of a courtroom, where Richard would fall directly from the peak of his arrogance to the bottom of hell. Richard raised his glass again and toasted his reflection in the mirror. The party over his wife's suffering tasted very sweet that night, unaware that it was his last supper as a free man. The provincial courtroom was packed that morning. The news that the sole heiress of Sterling Enterprises had fallen into a life of crime had captured the attention of the entire city. Journalists crowded in an area roped off with velvet cords. Television cameras were ready to record every moment of Valerie Sterling's downfall. The courtroom's air conditioning couldn't cope with the heat generated by the drama-thirsty spectators. Richard sat in the front row of the public gallery, right behind the defendant's table. He was playing his role as the heartbroken husband to perfection. His face was contorted with pain, and he occasionally dabbed the corners of his eyes with a handkerchief, though there were no tears. When the cameras focused on him, he would bow his head deeply, as if carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. Inside, he was smiling from ear to ear. The script was playing out smoothly. The lawyer he had hired for Valerie, an inexperienced young man already paid to lose, sat nervously at the defense table. A side door opened. The courtroom fell silent. Suddenly, Valerie entered, escorted by two bailiffs. She wore a red inmate's vest over a worn white shirt. Her body looked much thinner than when she was arrested a week before. Her face was pale and makeup-free, her cheekbones prominent. But there was one thing that made Richard frown. Valerie's eyes were not downcast with shame or empty with depression. They looked straight ahead, sharp and serene. Valerie sat at the defendant's table. She didn't turn an inch towards Richard, who tried to place a hand on her shoulder over the railing to keep up appearances. "Don't touch me," Valerie whispered coldly, loud enough for those in the front row to hear. Richard quickly withdrew his hand, surprised, and put on a hurt face to win the public's sympathy. The trial began. The prosecutor passionately read the charges: embezzlement, document forgery, and the flow of funds to an online gambling account which, he claimed, belonged to Valerie. All that fake evidence was read out one by one. Richard listened with satisfaction. It was the death sentence for his wife's reputation. When it was the defense's turn, the lawyer hired by Richard stood up hesitantly. We haven't been able to secure any witnesses in our favor, Your Honor. The defendant is resigned to her fate, he stammered, just as Richard had instructed him. The judge nodded, about to bang his gavel for a recess before the verdict. Very well, if there are no objections. Objection, Your Honor. A firm, authoritative female voice interrupted the judge. The main courtroom door swung open. All heads turned. There stood attorney Helen Morrison. She was not alone. She was accompanied by 3 assistants loaded with boxes of documents and a digital forensics expert. Her steps echoed loudly on the courtroom floor, radiating an aura of authority that silenced even the prosecutor. Richard's face, which had been feigning sadness, was now pale as wax. His eyes were about to pop out of their sockets in panic. How was this possible? He had made sure that Attorney Morrison had no access to the detention center. How could this old woman enter as the defense lawyer? I am Attorney Helen Morrison, legal representative for Mrs. Valerie Sterling, as per the power of attorney filed this morning with the court clerk, Morrison announced loudly, presenting a document at the lectern. She shot a look of contempt at Richard. And we bring new, absolute evidence. Evidence that will not only exonerate our client, but will place the real culprit in this very dock. Objection, Your Honor, Richard's lawyer shouted, flustered. This is a violation of procedure. New evidence should be dismissed. Overruled, the judge interrupted, looking intrigued. This is a case of great importance. The court needs the material truth. Proceed, Counselor Morrison. Attorney Morrison nodded to her assistant. The large projection screen in the courtroom descended, and the lights in the room dimmed. Your Honor, and everyone present, what you are about to see is digital data extracted from a shadow server that has been hidden all this time. These records come from a real-time security system embedded in a personal piece of jewelry belonging to my client. The screen lit up. A high-definition video appeared. It was a security camera video from an unusual angle, from the top of a cabinet where a smoke detector was located. The footage clearly showed Richard sitting at Valerie's desk. His hands were busy moving stacks of cash from a safe into a gym bag. His voice was heard clearly through the courtroom speakers. What a naive woman. She thinks she controls the company. As soon as she's in jail, all this fortune will be mine. Transfer $50 million to the Cayman Islands right now. Richard's voice on the recording laughed heartily. It was followed by another man's voice accepting his orders. Then the screen switched to a slide with an Excel spreadsheet. On the left, the financial report from the case against Valerie. On the right, the original data from the locket's chip. The traces of manipulated dates and digital signatures were evident. The IP address of the person who made the changes was displayed in large font on the screen. Device, iPhone 15 Pro Max. User, Richard Vance. The silence in the courtroom was broken by an uproar. Journalists scrambled to photograph the screen. Whispers turned into shouts of ridicule towards Richard. It's a lie! It's a setup, a deepfake! Richard shouted hysterically, jumping up from his seat. His face was red with panic and rage. The mask of the grieving husband had shattered, revealing his true, cruel nature. Sit down, the judge yelled, banging his gavel hard. Mr. Vance, I forbid you from disrupting the session. Attorney Morrison smiled slightly and turned to Valerie. For the first time, Valerie turned around and looked her husband in the eye. No tears, no hysteria. Valerie simply looked at Richard with a cold, penetrating gaze, the look of a queen watching the traitor of her kingdom squirm in a dead end. Your Honor, Morrison continued in a calm but lethal voice, this evidence also proves that the funds that supposedly disappeared were actually transferred to a personal account of Mr. Richard Vance 2 days before my client's arrest. We request the court to immediately freeze Mr. Vance's assets and detain him for case tampering, perjury, and money laundering. Richard trembled violently, his legs gave way. He looked for support from the lawyer he had hired, but the lawyer was already packing his briefcase, ready to abandon the sinking ship. Valerie took a deep breath. The air in the room, which had previously felt suffocating, was now incredibly fresh. She saw the hand that Attorney Morrison held out to her. Valerie took the old woman's hand. This counterattack had not been fought with insults or violence, but with irrefutable facts. Today, Valerie had regained not only her freedom but also her dignity, which was once trampled upon. The wheel of fate had turned, stopping exactly at Richard's lowest point. The atmosphere in the courtroom turned into controlled chaos. The judge's gavel struck 3 times with force, a sound that to Richard was like a death sentence. Based on the new evidence, which is extremely compelling, the court rules to suspend the detention of the defendant, Valerie Sterling. In the interest of justice, I order the prosecutor's office to open an immediate investigation into Mr. Richard Vance. At these words, thunderous applause erupted from the audience, which had until then contained its anger at seeing Richard's arrogance. "No, this is unfair. You're all in on it. I'm the legal husband. I saved the company," Richard screamed blindly as 2 bailiffs grabbed him by the arms. His face, always immaculate, was now red and congested. The veins in his neck bulged. He looked like a madman who had lost his mind. Valerie stood up from the defendant's table. A female bailiff politely removed the handcuffs from her hands. The click of the shackles being released sounded like the most beautiful song of freedom. Valerie rubbed her reddened wrists and then turned completely to face Richard, who was being dragged away. Valerie's steps were slow but firm as she approached her husband, who was still resisting in the cordoned-off aisle. She gestured to the bailiffs to stop for a moment. The bailiffs complied with her request, as if respecting the aura of dignity that emanated from her. Now, only a few feet separated them. Richard was panting, looking at his wife. "Valerie, help me. They've made a mistake. You know I love you, right? This was all for us. Don't let them take me." Richard switched tactics in an instant, trying to plead with the pitiful face that had always melted Valerie's heart. Valerie looked at that face, the face she once adored, with whom she thought she would grow old. Now she only saw a pathetically cracked mask. "For us?" Valerie asked softly. Her voice was calm but chilled to the bone. "You sold me for a fortune, Richard. You threw me in the trash for a throne. From the moment you smiled as the police dragged me out of our house, there was no us anymore. But if they arrest me, the company's stock will plummet. We'll be ruined, Valerie. Think about that. Withdraw the complaint, and we'll split everything 50-50. Richard tried to negotiate, showing his nature that only cared about material things. Valerie smiled slightly, a smile filled with pity. "Richard, you forget one thing. That company is not a money-making machine. It's the legacy of my father's honesty. I'd rather lose everything than let a parasite like you run it. Take him away," Valerie ordered the bailiffs. Richard screamed again, spouting crude curses as he was forcibly dragged towards a temporary holding cell, a cell as dirty as the one he had put Valerie in. When the drama ended, Attorney Morrison approached Valerie. The veteran lawyer's face looked serious. "Valerie, the fight isn't over yet. This is just a victory in the criminal trial. Now we face a crueler battlefield, business reality." Attorney Morrison showed her tablet. The stock chart for Sterling Enterprises was in a freefall. The scandal of CEO Richard Vance's fraud and the news of owner Valerie Sterling's arrest had caused panic among investors. Banks began to call, demanding early repayment of loans, considering them at risk of default. The fines for management negligence that had to be paid to the state due to Richard's actions were also enormous, an amount almost impossible to pay with the company cash that Richard had already siphoned off. "The choice is difficult, Valerie," Attorney Morrison explained cautiously. "We can save part of your fortune by hiding the truth about these losses, manipulate the reports a bit to make them look stable, and then sell your shares to a foreign investor before everything completely collapses. You could still live a rich, luxurious life abroad. But your father's company's reputation would be forever stained as a fraudulent company." Valerie was silent. The offer was tempting. A comfortable life, no problems, and to forget this nightmare. Who would blame her? She was the victim. It was natural for her to want to save herself. However, the face of Officer Romero appeared in her mind, the sincere face of that guard who risked his career for a good deed Valerie's father had planted 10 years ago, and the faces of the hundreds of loyal employees who had worked for her family for decades, like her secretary, Miss Davis. If Valerie fled and sold the company, they would all lose their jobs. The fate of their families would be shattered. Richard had taken the easy way out, and look where he had ended up. Valerie didn't want to be like Richard. Valerie looked up and met Attorney Morrison's gaze with unwavering determination. "No, counselor, I'm not running away. I'm not going to deceive the investors." The risk is that you will lose almost all your personal wealth to cover the hole Richard created. The house, the cars, the jewelry, the savings. You'll have to sell it all to pay the fines and inject capital for the company to survive. You'll be poor, Valerie, Attorney Morrison reminded her with a concerned but proud tone. I was born the daughter of the president of Sterling Enterprises, not because of his wealth, but because of his teachings, Valerie replied firmly. I'd rather be a poor woman who can sleep peacefully, without regrets, than a rich one who lives in the shadow of a lie. Like Richard, release all the data, counselor. We'll conduct a transparent audit. I will take full responsibility. Attorney Morrison smiled broadly. Tears welled in her old eyes. She hugged Valerie like a mother hugging her daughter who had just passed the toughest test of her life. Your father would be smiling proudly from heaven, my dear. You truly are his daughter. That afternoon, Valerie left the courthouse. A light drizzle greeted her. She didn't go back to her luxurious estate. It was now seized as collateral. She took Attorney Morrison's modest car to a small rental apartment. In the car, Valerie saw the news on her phone screen. Richard had been officially named the prime suspect, facing a threat of 20 years in prison. Valerie put her phone down and looked out the window. The skyscrapers of Chicago looked gray. She knew that tomorrow would be a very hard day. She would start selling her luxury items one by one. She would face the wrath of the shareholders. She would begin a much more modest life. Perhaps very modest. But strangely, Valerie's heart felt light, very light. The weight of hypocrisy, the weight of a false marriage, and the weight of a fortune that had become a shackle. It was all gone. Through the wet window glass, Valerie saw her own reflection, the face of a woman who had lost her palace but had regained her soul. The following weeks were the most exhausting, but at the same time, the most liberating for Valerie. True to her promise to Attorney Morrison and her own conscience, Valerie carried out a complete cleanup. She didn't want a single cent of dirty money or debt to weigh on her father's honor. Her valuable assets were liquidated one by one. The luxury cars that once lined up arrogantly in her garage now had new owners. The diamond jewelry, designer bags, and even her personal investment stocks, everything was sold. The culmination was when a for sale sign was placed in front of the gates of her luxurious estate. The house, a silent witness to false happiness and painful betrayal, finally had to be handed over to cover the state fines and severance for the employees Richard had temporarily laid off. Valerie now stood in the empty living room. The echo of her footsteps resonated on the marble floor. There were no more expensive paintings or imported leather sofas, just clean, white walls. Strangely, Valerie didn't feel sad. On the contrary, she felt a lightness in her chest, as if thousands of tons of weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She left that house with only 2 suitcases of clothes and a box of memories with photos of her late parents. In front of the gate, an old gray van was waiting. It was the car of her former secretary, Miss Davis, whom Richard had fired. Miss Davis, with a sincere smile, stood by the car, ready to receive her boss, not as a superior, but as a comrade. "Ready to start a new life, boss?" Miss Davis asked enthusiastically. Valerie smiled, the freest smile she'd had in years. "Completely ready, Miss Davis. Thank you for joining me to start from scratch again." "0 is a good number, boss. From 0 we can go anywhere," Miss Davis replied wisely. While Valerie was starting her new life in a modest rental house on the outskirts of the city, Richard was experiencing a completely opposite fate. That afternoon, in the back lot of the prosecutor's office, an ironic scene took place. Valerie had to go sign a final document for the return of evidence unrelated to the case, her wallet and ID documents that had been confiscated. Just as Valerie was walking out of the building with a light step, an armored transport van had just arrived. The back door of the vehicle was roughly opened by a guard. The figure of a man with his hands cuffed and wearing a bright orange inmate's vest appeared. His hair, once always impeccable, was now disheveled. His face, covered by a scruffy beard, was gaunt, and his eyes were sunken from lack of sleep. It was Richard. He had just been transferred from temporary police detention to the state prison to await his sentencing. Fate had finally brought them together at a cruel but just crossroads. Valerie, newly impoverished but free, stood face to face with Richard, broken and imprisoned. Richard's steps stopped when he saw the figure of a plainly dressed woman standing not far away. Valerie wore a simple cotton shirt and pants, with no jewelry or heavy makeup. But to Richard's eyes, Valerie looked radiant, far more dignified than when she was brimming with wealth. Their eyes met. Richard struggled to break free from the guard's grip, trying to move towards Valerie. "Valerie! Valerie, look at me!" he shouted in a broken voice, a desperate mix of rage and pleading. "Are you satisfied? Are you satisfied seeing your husband like this? You've ruined my life." Valerie didn't back down. She stood firm, looking directly at the man she once loved with a cold gaze. There was no explosive hatred, only a cool pity. "I didn't ruin you, Richard," Valerie replied calmly, her voice clear above the wind. "Your own greed did. I just gave you back what you deserved. The consequences. I'm your husband. You should have defended me. We could have run away together. You stupid woman," Richard cursed, reverting to his true nature as he was cornered. Valerie slowly shook her head. "That stupid woman died in the solitary cell you prepared for her, Richard. The one standing in front of you now is a new Valerie. A Valerie who knows that pride can't be bought with stolen money." The guards began to forcibly drag Richard towards the tall, gloomy prison gates. Richard resisted, his feet dragging on the asphalt. "Valerie, don't go! Help me! I don't want to go in there. I have a lot of enemies in there, Valerie." Richard's screams were heartbreaking to anyone who heard them, but Valerie's heart towards him was already frozen. She watched as the huge metal gates opened. She knew very well what lay beyond. Dark corridors, the smell of dampness, hard food, and a piercing loneliness. Richard was going to feel every moment of the suffering he had planned for her. Perhaps worse, because Richard had no one with a sincere heart, like Officer Romero, to save him. "Enjoy your palace, Richard," Valerie murmured under her breath. The gates closed with a deafening clang, swallowing Richard's figure and his screams. Silence fell. Valerie took a deep breath, inhaling the air of freedom that felt so fresh. She turned around, turning her back on that prison. "Miss." Davis was waving to her from the old car. The afternoon sun warmly illuminated the asphalt road ahead. The road might not be as smooth as a highway. It might have many stones and dust, but it was her own road, a road she had chosen with honesty. "Let's go home, Miss Davis," Valerie said as she got into the car. "We have a lot of catering orders to prepare tomorrow morning." The old car drove away slowly, leaving the prosecutor's office behind. Behind them, the prison walls stood firm, separating two destinies that were now as different as heaven and earth. The wife who lost her fortune but regained her soul, and the husband who chased fortune but lost everything, including himself. 2 years had passed since the judge's gavel sounded and the prison gates separated two distinct destinies. Time had followed its own course, healing the wounds of those willing to accept it and carving even deeper regret into the greedy. That morning, in a modest commercial space on the outskirts of the city, the hustle and bustle began at dawn. A delicious aroma of fried onions and spices filled the air, replacing the expensive perfumes and automatic air fresheners Valerie's nose was used to. In front of the shop hung a simple banner that read, "The Blessing Kitchen Catering." Valerie, wearing an apron slightly stained with turmeric, was skillfully serving rice into hundreds of paper boxes. Sweat beaded on her temples. Her hair was tied back messily, but her face radiated a vitality never seen when she occupied the CEO's chair. "Boss, the order for the orphanage celebration is ready for transport," Miss Davis shouted from the packing area. The former secretary, who always wore a suit, now wore an equally comfortable t-shirt, having become her business partner. "All right, Miss Davis. Make sure not to forget the sweet treats. The kids love them," Valerie replied with a wide smile. At the same time, in a distant and isolated place, a completely opposite atmosphere was unfolding. Inside a cramped, stuffy cell, Richard sat staring at a wall covered in graffiti. 2 years in prison had turned him into a frail old man. His body had wasted away, and his graying hair was starting to thin. Not a trace of the handsome CEO remained. His high society friends had disappeared. His mistress had long since abandoned him. As soon as she learned Richard's assets had been seized by the state, his shamed family had cut all ties. Richard was truly alone. His only entertainment was the communal television in the prison lounge. And on that day, the greatest of ironies hit him in the face. On the TV screen, a show about small businesses featured the heartwarming story of a catering entrepreneur rising from adversity. There, Valerie's face appeared, smiling brightly as she talked about her secret recipes. Richard turned his face away, and tears of useless regret began to flow. He realized he had thrown away a diamond to pick up a burning coal. In the afternoon, the hustle of the Blessing kitchen began to wind down. Valerie sat on a plastic chair on the shop's patio, fanning herself and enjoying a cup of hot, sweet tea. An old motorcycle pulled up in front of the shop. When the driver took off his helmet, a familiar, aged face appeared, with a thick mustache that was now completely white. It was the former prison guard, now retired, Mr. Romero. "Good afternoon, ma'am," Mr. Romero greeted with his characteristic deep voice, but this time accompanied by the warm smile of a grandfather. Valerie was pleasantly surprised. She immediately took the old man's hand with respect. "Hello, Mr. Romero. What a joy. How are you? Come, sit down." Mr. Romero sat down on the plastic chair. His eyes scanned the simple but lively shop. He looked intently at Valerie. "I saw you on TV this morning, ma'am. You looked different." "Different how, sir? More disheveled?" Valerie joked. Mr. Romero shook his head. "More alive. When I saw you in the solitary cell, you looked like a wilted flower forced to grow on concrete, but now you look like a sturdy tree with deep roots in the earth." Valerie smiled slightly. Her eyes gazed into the distance, watching the busy street at sunset. "You're right, sir. I used to have everything. A big house, many cars, countless money, but I had no peace. I was sleeping with the enemy, eating with hypocrisy." Mr. Romero took a sip of the tea Miss Davis had served him. "Do you have any regrets? If you had cheated a little back then, as your lawyer advised, maybe you could have saved what was left of your fortune." "No, sir, not at all," Valerie replied firmly, without hesitation. "Losing my fortune was a small price to pay for the freedom of my soul. That prison, and your help, made me realize that true wealth isn't in our wallet, but in who stands by our side when we fall." Valerie looked at Mr. Romero with teary eyes. "If you hadn't risked your life to get that locket out, I'd probably still be rotting in there. You taught me that even in the filthiest place, there is the pure gold of sincerity." Mr. Romero smiled and gently patted Valerie's shoulder. "It wasn't me, ma'am. It was the good deed you yourself planted 10 years ago. Good deeds are like a boomerang, ma'am. No matter how far you throw them, they always find a way to come back to their owner." The sun began to set, leaving an orange glow on the western horizon. Valerie's heart felt full. She no longer owned skyscrapers, but she had the Blessing kitchen. She had loyal friends like Miss Davis and guardian angels like Mr. Romero. While Richard, trapped behind cold iron bars, mourned his dark fate, Valerie had found true freedom in simplicity. She proved that even if someone is thrown into the mud of a prison, if their heart is gold, it will still shine when it comes out.